My name is Park Wilde, and people are still logging in even as we get rolling here to the webinar, which we do periodically. This might be about the third or fourth that we've done over the years for the Flying Less initiative, which is a petition initiative focused on university communities and professional associations as a stepping stone towards broader social change. We focus on a petition initiative with which I'll tell you a little more about later in the session. Here's going to be our agenda. This is our initial introduction. I'm so pleased that our keynote speaker is going to be Dr. Kim Nicholas of Lund University, talking about innovations and progress in flying less. So Kim, thank you so much for joining us. We've already rehearsed the handoff, so you know how to grab the screen share back for your side there, and we look forward to your presentation. Thank you for joining us.
So thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here, and I really appreciate the inspiration and support from Park and this community. So it's great to be part of the webinar. Today I'll be sharing some progress that we've made here at my institution, Luxus, the Lund University Center for Sustainability Studies. We're in southern Sweden. And I'll start, though, by sharing a little bit of my own flying less journey. And like so many things, it all started over a beer. I had flown in 2012 to a conference at IASA in Vienna. And I was at a pub having a beer with my friend Charlie Wilson. And we had spent all day at this conference where we heard so many depressing statistics about all the emissions that were continuing to increase and trends that are going in the wrong direction and how urgent it was to make change. And I just felt this enormous sense of cognitive dissonance that I had flown to this conference. Many of the people in the room had flown to this conference, and I knew how big of an impact that was on the climate. So Charlie was the only person I knew who had at that point taken steps to fly less himself. He had stopped flying within Europe. I also found this community, I don't remember exactly when, but sometime not too long, I think, thereafter, as the petition was getting started. And I found that really encouraging and uplifting. It was great to know that so many people really all over the world were having similar thoughts and trying to make change happen. I was also inspired by this article then a bit later from Peter Kalmus, who's been another leader that's inspired a lot of people, really counting up his emissions from flying and recognizing how big those were for people who do fly, knowing that that made such a huge contribution to my carbon footprint and was something that I could really do something about was really important to know. It had another piece of important background is a former master's student of ours, Seth Wines, who's now a PhD student at the University of British Columbia, together with Simon Donner, did a study that came out last summer and showed how few flyers at the University of British Columbia accounted for half of emissions. Was also more and more confronted with the urgency and importance of flying less from a study that Seth led for his master's thesis, and we published together in 2017. We assembled 39 studies that looked at the life cycle carbon footprint of personal choices that people in industrialized countries with big carbon footprints have the power to make. And we identified that 4 of these choices were potentially really high impact. So those were eating a plant-based diet, living car-free, avoiding flying, and planning or choosing to have smaller families. And we know that the first 3 of those are emissions that we have today. The IPCC 1.5 degrees report says that we need to cut emissions about in half globally and more rapidly in high-emitting places and countries and individuals if we're going to have a chance at staying below 1.5 degrees. And so we know that it's really urgent to make cuts, and the biggest places to start for that are in flying, driving, and what we eat. The long-term climate implications of the current lifestyles and emissions are also very large. But that's something to think about in informing the personal choice of family planning. Some examples here, I think it's really helpful to have positive stories that give people ideas and help spread the word. So Wired magazine did a story in the spring that looked at scientists traveling by train or avoiding flying. There was a feature of some people traveling to AGU, the big American Geophysical Union conference, one of the biggest climate conferences in the world, by train, and I think that got a lot of attention. There was just a story published by this researcher who hasn't flown since 1995, and she's still managed to get to Japan and to the US for conferences. So I think this has been, it's nice to see some of these stories getting attention and giving people ideas and inspiration. I've put together a slide deck of some of the research on academic flying and flying less, good practices and tips. So here's one of the slides from that deck, basically giving some good advice, showing how big the carbon footprint of conferences are, and in this case for a conference held in Europe, showing how much of the emissions, in this case half, came from people flying from outside of Europe. And some of their suggestions, making sure that trying to host conferences in a central location that are accessible by train, if inviting people who are going to fly from long distances away, making sure they have a key role in trying to make sure they're really benefiting and giving a lot to being at that conference. Don't selecting exotic or remote conference locations. I mean, I think we all know or have colleagues or maybe have been ourselves to, Hawaii in December or the Canary Islands or whatever it is. So these kind of destinations really make it difficult to reduce flying, obviously. And then some practical tips on sort of how to help organize a flying less conference. This report that I mentioned briefly that Seth and Simon did at the University of British Columbia ended up having a 5-step strategy that I think is a really helpful way to get started. So basically starting with a communication strategy where the default or the first choice would be virtual meetings and making sure the infrastructure and support is in place to do that. Mandating or only supporting economy class tickets because those are much lower emissions than business or first class. Making an easy way to automate emissions accounting. That we still need to do more easily, but the best would be if we can easily access the data that we book through our university travel agent, but we don't have that yet. They suggest an internal emissions offsets program, so when flights are taken, putting funds aside to reduce emissions from your department or your university elsewhere. And I've heard of some really interesting projects that are doing that we can certainly talk about more. And then their suggestion is to have this incentives program where emissions are reported, kind of there's a sunshine policy. This becomes more transparent information, and both at the individual and at the institutional level. So far, it looks as we have made it up to the individual. We're not, I'm planning to publish online my own pledge, but not everyone is going to do that. So we'll see how that goes for us. So this is a link to a home site where I've started putting together a few resources on academics flying less, including many from Parks Initiative, and the slide deck that I mentioned where I have some of the academic literature on flying less, as well as some examples and links to the LUXUS pledge and other resources. I'll just go on wrapping up to talk about a new project that I'm really excited we got support for in November. We're going to be hiring a PhD student to start in September to lead some of this work. So the project is called The Takeoff of Staying on the Ground, and together with my colleague Johanna Strippel, we're going to look at media and social media analysis of the discussion around flying in Sweden. This has been really big in the news in the last year or two. There have been some really high-profile stories and both a vigorous debate leading to a flight tax that was implemented last April, so April 2018, was very much the subject of the election, which we just had in September, and part of the delay, we can say, we didn't have a government until a few weeks ago. So since September, from September till now, there was this long delay, and one of the issues being debated and sort of dividing parties on this was the flight tax. So in the end, we now have a government that continues to support the flight tax, but it may be reformed further. So it's really gotten a lot of attention, and there's been a lot of perspectives aired on it. I'll show just a few examples of that. This is an Instagram account called Clueless Influencers that kind of names and shames. So on the left is screenshot of an article in a national newspaper of a Swedish politician who traveled with her family to the Canary Islands. And, the story in the paper was kind of oh, celebrities, they're just like us, they take their family to the beach or something like this. And then this account is, problematizing the CO2 from this travel and criticizing this behavior. They also have positive things to say about people who are not flying. In this case on the right, this is a Swedish athlete who's now covering sports for the national television channel, and he traveled by train to Slovenia. So this is an example of the kind of media we'll be analyzing and trying to draw out the debate. Just a couple more things to wrap up. So an article that came out recently, there was a magazine that contacted me and wanted to discuss what would happen if we stopped flying. Like, what if no more planes were used at all and there was no more flight industry? And that was really thought-provoking for me. That's a thought I had never had, actually, and to seriously think through and consider. So I think it's interesting that this is where the debate is going. And nobody is, I don't know, this isn't a serious policy proposal or anything at the moment to completely eliminate flying, but it was an interesting thought experiment to go through. There was an article, or rather an issue of the local newspaper in southern Sweden in the summer that was entirely about climate and the environment. So the cover on the left shows, you are here on planet Earth, and every article in it across all of the sections had to do with the climate, basically, including this survey they had done that showed that actually 1 in 5 people in our region in southern Sweden were trying to choose not to fly. And I found this really encouraging because around this same time, or just before this came out, there was an article in Science that showed that 25% of a group needs to exhibit a behavior before there's a norm tipping point, basically. So 20% is pretty close to that. So I feel encouraged that this is starting to really catch momentum, and I see a lot of potential. My last slide here is just an example of something that I think is a really good idea from an NGO in the UK called 1010. And their idea is that they want to encourage companies to offer something called climate perks, which would be to give employees more time off to travel for their private travel for their holidays by train, or to travel more slowly. So this would be just a positive incentive to do that. I think Lior is on the call, and he may have been involved with this as well. I know that they're still looking for partners, so I thought that's just one idea that might give people some inspiration. So with that, let me wrap up and see if there are any questions.
Hi, Kim. This is Lior. I have a question for you.
Hi, Lior.
So first of all, thanks so much for sharing this. This is really fantastic to see this all put together in one place. Yeah, so my question is, these initiatives all make a ton of sense thinking about institutions. I'm in a slightly different position now, which is that I am working with an academic society in my field that decided to put together a climate impact task force to address some of these issues for the society. That would be great.
Great. Thank you so much, and thanks for leading that initiative. That sounds wonderful, and I mean, the chance to reach 4,000 people is amazing. In the slide deck that I mentioned, I have a couple of slides that will be relevant for you. There was a study in a Nature journal that looked at the climate impact of conferences and showed that basically most conferences don't have any kind of environmental policy, or a very superficial one at best. I can recommend a resource that was put together by Ryan Katz-Rosen, Katzrosene, where they assembled some best practices on virtual conferences, and there was just some discussion about it on Twitter the other day. So let me know if you can't find it, but hopefully that's enough for you to try to dig it up.
But I see Joe Nevins, my co-organizer on this Flagless initiative, is on, and I wondered if you wanted to say a word of greetings, Joe.
Okay. Well, greetings to everyone. I'm really excited to see so many people on this, and it's nice to make your acquaintance vicariously, or from afar. I do want to reiterate what people said. Kim, that was a fabulous presentation. I have many questions. I was sitting back, waiting for others to do it, but I hope to communicate with you by email and with the rest of you. So it's inspiring to have so many people, with us. And again, I look forward to continuing this discussion in various ways.